Yakubu Gowon was only 31 years old when he rose to become Nigeria's second military head of state on August 1, 1966. He went on to rule the country for 9 straight years. On July 29, 1975, General Gowon was overthrown while attending an Organization of African Union (OAU) summit in Kampala, Uganda. The overthrow would be an unprecedented bloodless one, the first time in Nigeria's history. In this episode, we bring to your view the rise and fall of Yakubu Gowon. Yakubu Gowon enlisted into the Nigerian army and trained in Officer Cadre Training School, Teshi, Ghana in 1954. He was promoted Major in 1962, Lieutenant Colonel in 1963, named Adjutant General, Nigerian Army from 1963 to 1965, was Chief of Staff in January 1966, became the second military ruler on August 1, 1966, promoted Major General in 1967, and became a 4-star general in 1971. During the weekend of July 29, 1966, following a violent rolling mutiny that led to the overthrow and murder of his predecessor, Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, Gowon became the new head of state and the supreme commander of the Nigerian Armed Forces. He was only 31. Soon after Gowon was anointed as the new supreme commander, the separation from the army began. Like Ironsi, the title Supreme Commander conferred certain absolute powers on him, a structural weakness that would eventually consume the Gowon regime as it led to the subsequent emergence of powerful state governors. These governors used the distractions of the federal government first, with the restoration of law and order in the barracks, and later with the prosecution of the war to consolidate their powers. It was not that obvious during the conflict but became apparent afterwards, particularly from the standpoint of their military colleagues in the barracks. At the federal level, Gowon, who had little prior experience in non-military public administration, was kept within the outstretched arms of the sophisticated civil servants. In October 1970, Gowon announced a 6-year 9-point plan, which he said must be accomplished before the government of the country can be handed over to the politicians. According to Gowon, the target year to accomplish this 9-point plan and return the country to normal constitutional government was 1976. Although the 1973 census was one of the few items among his 9-point plan that he pursued with vigor, the census actually turned out to be a blunder and perhaps the most serious political misadventure of the Gowon era. Results released in May 1974 against the advice of the Census Commission indicated that Nigeria's population, supposedly 79.76 million people, had increased by 43.3% since 1963, far more than any other developing country. With 64% of the reported population, the North had registered an increase of 72.4% since the 1963 result that was controversial even then. The Midwest had increased in population by 27.6% and the East by 11%, while the West decreased by 6.0%. Lagos increased by 71.5%. In spite of the ban on political activity, prominent Nigerians went public with angry protests against the results. Gowon did try, unconvincingly, to reassure the nation that a post-enumeration check, but not a recount, would be conducted and that the final result would be released in October 1975. However, it never happened. In January 1971, Gowon, reeling under accusations that his wartime actions were responsible for inflation, implemented the recommendations of the Chief Simeon Adebo Wages and Salaries Commission and increased the salaries of workers. Surprisingly, labor unrest resulted as his Commissioner for Information, Anthony Enahoro, announced that private companies that had increased their salaries at least once since 1964 would be exempted. In early 1975, oil production fell steeply because of a sudden decline in world demand, resulting in lower prices and shortfalls in revenue expectations. Although prices recovered somewhat later in the year after an intervention by OPEC, the temporary economic gloom and alleged mismanagement that caused it, combined with the widespread industrial action in May and June, which brought the country to a standstill, helped in rationalizing the overthrow of the Gowon government in July of that year. The Gowon administration was not spared from corrupt practices. For example, by the time of the coup, the average commercial property holding of his governors was estimated at about 8 houses each in the range of 49,000 to 120,000 naira, along with farming estates. This was a big deal at the time, although, using standards of Nigerian corruption in subsequent regimes, Gowon's governors were in retrospect Boy Scouts, as far as stealing is concerned. Nevertheless, like many regimes that came after, he did make an initial and ongoing effort to be seen combating corruption, such as with the investigation of Assets Decree number 37 of 1968 and subsequent efforts to investigate and punish deep-seated postal corruption in the military. For example, using the technique of over-invoicing, construction materials were often bought outside the country by public servants and contractors at exorbitant prices. Even the practice of importing expired drugs was already well established. Two important things to note about the July 29, 1975 coup are: 1. It was bloodless. 2. It was carried out by Gowon's kinsman, his right-hand man, Colonel Joseph Navin Garba. He was the commander of the Brigade of Guards. He announced the coup on Radio Nigeria, and it was rumored he was also from the same town as Gowon. The officer who made the announcement was no ordinary colonel. He was the commander of the elite brigade of guards in the federal capital. He was also widely regarded as a confidant of General Gowon and trusted loyalist of the regime. His co-option and active participation or neutralization were crucial to the bloodless nature and success of the coup. During the civil war, Garba selected a special unit of men drawn from the Ngas tribe and charged them with Gowon's personal safety. Now, let us look at some of the factors that worked against Gowon which brought about the overthrow. During the Nigerian Civil War, Yakubu Gowon had no prior field command experience above the sub-unit level. He was very well trained, no doubt, perhaps one of the best trained, and had plenty of staff experience, but he had never actually commanded a battalion, let alone a brigade, and certainly not a division. The divisional commanders were mostly independent, doing what they liked. When they misbehaved, Gowon preferred a non-confrontational approach. Also, as a major general, Gowon hardly visited the war front. When he did, the war had already been in progress for almost 2 years. It was in early 1969. Gowon also had a habit of communicating directly with field commanders using a radio set at Dodan Barracks, bypassing the army headquarters. There was plenty of waste and massive corruption not only in the Ministry of Defense, but also among arms purchasing teams and dealers sent abroad to acquire weapons and ammunition. Political undercurrents were never far from the surface either. As noted earlier, Gowon promised to hand over in 1976, but in an Independence Day broadcast on October 1, 1974, he reneged on that promise. In 1969, Gowon got married to Miss Victoria Zakari in a state and society wedding in Lagos, which, considering the wartime situation and ongoing suffering, appeared lavishly distasteful and arrogant to many observers, including war front commanders. The presence of a resident woman in his life naturally resulted in a decrease in Gowon's interactions with his former army bachelor, Joseph Garba. Gowon also compounded his situation by gradually becoming distant from his constituency, that is, the army. After September 1974, his increasingly frustrated Guard Brigade commander, for example, had to book an appointment just to see him. Many other officers who could drop in the past or came to expect occasional working dinners found access to him increasingly restricted. Unfortunately, some army officers were privately getting tired of Gowon. Some began to be alarmed that they might be destroyed if they remained allied with him in the face of opposition from the army and increasing public tension. Among those that felt this way were two of his closest officers, Colonel Joseph Navin Garba of the Guards Brigade and Anthony Ochefu, the Provost Marshal. After a private meeting in Garba's office, they both resolved that Gowon must be overthrown as head of state, preferably without any bloodshed. About 2 weeks before General Gowon left for the OAU summit in Kampala on July 27, 1975, his chief security officer, MD Yusuf, as he was popularly known, approached him with very specific and credible information. But Gowon didn't believe in the coup story about his right-hand man. However, Yusuf had good reason to be very concerned. In addition to his civilian sources, one or more of the military planners had directly approached him to say that a coup was in the offing. He did not know what to make of such a blatant leak, except to conclude that it may have been a clear warning to Gowon for old time's sake to make what changes were necessary to avert the overthrow. Yusuf also volunteered to confront Garba personally about the plot, so as to convince Gowon to take action, but Gowon opted to do so himself. Hence, before leaving for Kampala on July 27th, he asked Garba directly about it, and Garba once again denied it. As the saying goes, military regimes are unnaturally unstable. It would appear that General Gowon trusted the word of Colonel Garba as an officer and gentleman but did not verify. But Garba was not alone, nor the first to pledge loyalty to Gowon and then forsake his pledge. Indeed, all acts of treason in history are typically predicated on a violation of an oath of loyalty and often rationalized by higher supraconstitutional calls to duty to God and country. The most important qualification of a coup plotter, therefore, is the willingness to betray trust. On July 25th, the First Lady, Mrs. Victoria Gowon, left Nigeria for London. Her husband had not wanted her to leave until he returned from Kampala, but she insisted, fearing that she might miss the summer sales at upscale London stores. Before Mrs. Gowon left, the Army Chief of Staff, Major General David Akpode Ejo, also left the country on vacation, as did a few military governors. Gowon's official delegations in Kampala comprised a mix of federal commissioners, state governors, military and police officers, and civil servants. Because Gowon did not share his internal anxieties with others, key elements of his regime were not forewarned to be in a coup-busting mood. He did not contact army commanders in any other parts of the country, did not confine soldiers to barracks, and gave no clear-cut instructions about what various officers and formations should do in the event of a coup attempt. Following departure ceremonies, General Gowon's executive aircraft taxied to take a position for takeoff. He had no idea that it would be very many years before he would return to his homeland. He had believed Garba's denials but still felt there was something to the coup rumor and privately considered options for a quick return from Kampala to crush any attempt. Anyway, with Gowon's plane off the ground and airborne, the coup plotters swung into action to execute the final 48 hours of the plot. They quarantined the airport and increased surveillance of key personnel of the Gowon regime. Fortunately, they resisted the temptation to grab Gowon at the airport in what could have triggered a messy shootout. After the confirmation of the physical presence of General Gowon in Kampala and the location of other key government personalities, the execution phase of the plot began. At about 10 p.m. on July 28, 1975, the final operations group meeting took place at the Lagos Garrison Organization. Targets and tasks were divided in standard fashion. In order of priority, the most sensitive were the Dodan Barracks, office and residence of General Gowon, Ministry of Defense, Army, Air Force and the Navy headquarters on Marina, and the police headquarters on Moloney Street. Plans for the neutralization of some radio and TV stations in major centers outside Lagos were made, and the latest intelligence revealed the location and movement of key personalities. The commander-in-chief was away in Uganda. The chief of staff, Supreme Headquarters, was no threat because he was a naval officer with no troops and had never had the appetite to fight for power. The chief of army staff, Major General Ejo, was outside the country. The chiefs of air and naval staff would be politely informed of the change of government, and same was to go for the Inspector General of Police, Alhaji Kam Silem. At about 4 a.m., therefore, the pre-agreed outline of a coup announcement was fine-tuned, and Colonel Garba went over to Radio Nigeria to deliver it at 6 a.m. By time zone, Kampala in Uganda is 2 hours ahead of Lagos in Nigeria. In other words, 6 a.m. in Lagos on July 29, 1975 was actually 8 a.m. in Kampala. Gowon, focused on his agenda for the day, was oblivious of what was about to happen. Throughout the crucial hours of July 28, no one had contacted the head of state. It was as if he had been living and ruling on borrowed time. At the Nile Hotel in Kampala, getting up early on that second day of the OAU conference, General Gowon, a former chairman of the organization, prepared himself for the usual diplomatic push and pull of the summit. Mr. Mbao of UNESCO was delivering a speech at the time. Ugandan President Idi Amin then met with Gowon at the high table and gave him a note, which contained the news that he had been deposed in a coup. Gowon reportedly read the note and, in response to an inquiry from Amin, said the situation would become clearer as the day wore on. Apparently, this initial note did not specify the identity of the radio announcer in Lagos. Privately, Gowon was still thinking Colonel Gaba was on his side and that no coup would succeed without fierce resistance from the elite brigade of guards. He was wrong. After departing from the conference hall, Gowon spent the rest of the day quietly. By nightfall, Gowon already knew that Murtala Muhammad and Joe Garba were definitely involved. Who were the others, he wondered. When word came that Brigadier Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma, one of those he had counted on for support, had been appointed chief of the army in the new dispensation, Gowon was crushed. But most of the shock would come when the full list of members of the SMC and new state governors was released the next day. Nevertheless, General Gowon, far away in Kampala, had friends. Many offers of residence came to him in Kampala from various African countries. He notified the new regime in Lagos that he would leave Kampala for Lomé in Togo. He was flown to Lomé via Garwa in Cameroon. Part of the flight passed through Nigerians' airspace, and Gowon took the opportunity to transmit a radio message reaffirming loyalty to and support for Brigadier Murtala Muhammad's new regime. Although offered a permanent stay in Togo, Gowon chose to join his family in the United Kingdom. If you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to like and share it with your friends. You can subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to receive the latest videos as they drop. Also, don't miss our next video on the rise and fall of Idi Amin of Uganda.